On Sunday mornings, we hear 52 different sermons each year exploring our faith. You might not know that in 2023, there's actually 53 Sundays this year, so you'll get 53 sermons. But it's always the children's pageant that I think helps us see Jesus in a new light, from a new perspective, and I think it is so heartwarming. In terms of new perspectives on our faith, I have to tell you that our current sermon series right now is one of my all-time favorites because it is so surprisingly subversive, and it's helping me to see Jesus in a new light and a new perspective. If you haven't joined us for a Sunday in Advent yet, our sermon series is entitled 23andHe, and we are exploring the birth of Jesus from the perspective of his genealogy as it is presented in the first chapter of the Gospel of Matthew. So before the Magi or the shepherds or the angels, the writer of Matthew begins his entire account of the life of Jesus by sharing with us Jesus' family tree. If you have a Bible with you or you want to pluck one out of your pews or pull it up on your phone, turn to Matthew chapter 1. We already promised that we're not going to read through all of these names again, and so I won't do so, but I just want you to put your eyes on this laundry list of ancestors and soak in the fact that we typically skip right past this part of the chapter when we talk about Jesus' birth during Advent. We never read these verses. They're not part of any children's pageant, and yet there's something really, really powerful going on here. So geek out with me on the Bible for a second, because Jen and I can't stop talking about the fact that this really hasn't hit us so strongly before, and it's incredible. In this genealogy, there is absolutely no reason to include the names of 5 women. There's no precedent for it. In the ancient Near East, you didn't include the names of women, and so this is strange, it's weird. And for these women to have surprising, scandalous histories on top of that, something is going on here. And this isn't just a random person's genealogy. The author of Matthew is trying to convince you that this is the Messiah, the Son of God. So even more reason to excise any embarrassing facts about Jesus. And yet, these names are deliberately inserted when they don't have to be. Is anyone else's mind blown by that? Because mine is. And I can't figure it out. I don't have an explanation as to why it happened, other than that the presence of these women is supposed to teach us something about the birth of Jesus, about the entrance of God into the world. So we've already explored the lives of Tamar and Rahab, 2 women portrayed as prostitutes who possessed the resiliency to break the cycles in their family and to do whatever it was necessary to propel themselves forward, just as Jesus comes into the world to break the cycles of whatever trauma from our past holds us back and to help us write a new story. Then last week, Pastor Jen helped us lift up Bathsheba, who in the genealogy is intentionally introduced as the wife of Uriah. The gospel writer wasn't afraid to be honest with the fact that Jesus' past included King David's sordid story of rape and murder. Jen invited us to find healing by being honest about our own past and our own families. And today, we turn to the story of Ruth. The entire book of Ruth is only 4 chapters long, so you could go home and read it in its fullness later today. But travel with me to the same region where Jesus will appear, but about 1,200 years earlier, as we read a snippet from the book of Ruth, chapter 2. Now Naomi had a kinsman on her husband's side, a prominent rich man of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth, the Moabite, said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain behind someone in whose sight I may find favor." She said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she went. She came and gleaned in the field behind the reapers. As it happened, she came to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. Just then Boaz came from Bethlehem. He said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." They answered, "The Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to his young man who was in charge of the reapers, "To whom does this young woman belong?" The young man who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the reapers.' So she came, and she has been on her feet from early this morning until now without resting even for a moment." Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter. Do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Keep your eyes on the field that is being reaped and follow behind them. I have ordered the young men not to bother you. If you get thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn." Then she fell prostrate with her face to the ground and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your sight that you should take notice of me when I am a foreigner?" But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told me, how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. May the Lord reward you for your deeds, and may you have a full reward from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge." When we first meet Ruth at the beginning of the story, we are told that she is the daughter-in-law of an Israelite named Naomi. And even though her husband has died, instead of returning to her homeland, Ruth pledges to stay with Naomi. The text emphasizes again and again, just as it did in the portion we just read, that Ruth is a Moabite and not an Israelite. The Moabites were another ethnic group within the region of Canaan surrounding Israel, and they were a historical enemy to the Israelites. So much so that encoded in Israelite law and recorded in the Bible is this edict from Deuteronomy 23. "No Ammonite or Moabite shall come into the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. None of their descendants shall come into the assembly of the Lord forever. You shall never promote their welfare or their prosperity as long as you live." This injunction is pretty clear. No Moabites. And yet, here in the genealogy of Christ is Ruth, the Moabite. Ruth's interaction with her eventual husband Boaz in this chapter is pretty revolutionary in and of itself. Ruth is attempting a practice known as gleaning, where people who were poor were allowed to come into a field after the harvesters had completed their initial pass and glean anything left behind. Once again, this practice comes from an Israelite law, the one found in Leviticus 19, which says, "When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. You shall not strip your vineyard bare or gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the foreigner. I am the Lord your God." This law was a good one, meant to protect the most vulnerable in society. The only problem is that it was very seldom practiced. Very quickly in Israelite history, farmers, not surprisingly, became territorial over their property, and they would ensure that every last bit was properly harvested rather than allow someone to come and freely eat from the scraps. It was the ancient form of being opposed to welfare programs, and it was rampant. And so for Boaz to welcome gleaners into his field at all, let alone a Moabite, was quite unusual. And the result is that Ruth, the Moabite, marries Boaz, and the two of them become the great-grandparents of King David and the ancestors of Jesus. Not bad for someone about whom the Bible says, "You shall never promote their welfare or their prosperity as long as you live." In the vein of Pastor Jen's encouragement to be honest about the hardship of our families, I want to share a little bit more about mine in addition to what I shared 2 weeks ago. Now, of course, all that I know is just my own context, but each of us has our own genealogies, our own family trees, just like Jesus in Matthew 1, with your own stories and histories and unique characters. And so I want you to be thinking about your own stories as well. When I was 4 years old, my mother saw a special segment on the deplorable conditions of Romanian orphanages, and she became an emotional wreck. My parents already had 3 biological children, but my mother became convinced that God was calling her to pursue an international adoption. Now, my dad didn't quite hear the same voice. Funny how that works. But he always does what my mother tells him to do, and so he jumped on board. Since the biological brother I mentioned 2 weeks ago was deaf, she intentionally looked for children who were deaf and in need of adoption, because in my family, being deaf is something beautiful. You're part of a linguistic and cultural group. And so my parents went through the process of adopting a deaf brother from South Korea. But what they didn't know until he arrived in our home is that this brother, Isaac, has several other major medical challenges. His mother had tried to kill him when he was born by cutting him open, and the trauma of that experience left a myriad of issues. Isaac was legally blind, although his sight has been mostly restored through surgery. He's without growth hormones. He has severe intellectual disabilities that leave him by and large nonverbal, and he has severe autism. A few years later, my mother felt called to the adoption process again, and she was connected with a deaf child in Bulgaria who was 8 years old, and her family had arrived there from India. And as they were proceeding with the adoption, the agency they were working with let them know that the orphanage where my sister Hannah was located, anytime a child with disabilities became 8 years old, they would put them in a separate room until they starved and died. And that there was another girl who was deaf there, Abigail, my sister, who at 8 years old was already in this room and was only 26 pounds, and if they didn't take her, then she was going to die. My parents had no idea what to do with that information other than to adopt them both. But when they came, both Hannah and Abigail had a lot of baggage, behavioral baggage, issues such as stealing. Abigail has worked through a lot of that and is thriving now as an adult. But Hannah also had a violent psychosis and would sometimes attack me and my siblings. And so my family wasn't able to provide the intervention that she needed, and so she had to go to a place where she could receive care, and I actually haven't seen her in over 20 years. My mother felt called to adoption again a few years later. I should mention that when they got married, my dad made it clear to my mom that he wanted only one child. This time, my parents were connected to a domestic family and adopted my brother Levi. Levi's mother had been addicted to hard drugs, and as a result, he was born 3 months prematurely, which in turn contributed to him having cerebral palsy and being on the autism spectrum. He is a wonderfully bright spirit, and at 26 years old now, lives with my parents who provide caretaking for him. I love my family so much, and I am so proud of each member of my family and all of the hardships that they have worked through in life. The fact that my family continued to widen its circle of love and inclusion played a significant role in shaping me, but it's important to be honest that widening the circle also brought with it intense challenges, as you might imagine. There's no reason to sugarcoat that. Our family that seemed on the outside like a harmonious little United Nations was of course full of stress and chaos that no doubt pushed my parents to the brink of their capabilities. I'm sure that many of you can attest to the reality of family life sometimes having a pretty veneer for those who are viewing it from the outside, who think everything must be so good, when in reality, behind the scenes, everyone is just barely hanging on. This is especially true in the social media age, when we have the opportunity to present our best selves to the world. But I always think of the opening line of Tolstoy's Anna Karenina. Happy families are all alike. Unhappy families are unhappy in their own way. All of our families have unique challenges when the cameras are put down. The story of Ruth is a story of widening the circle of love and inclusion. Right in the middle of the history of the Israelite people is a story dedicated to welcoming a woman from a tribe with a clear injunction against ever including. And the story of Christ's birth is also a story of widening the circle of love and inclusion. This child is not meant for one group or one nation, but instead, in the words of the angels you heard today, he comes to bring good news of great joy to all people. There is no greater widening of the circle than that. And the story of our faith is also a story of widening our circle of love and inclusion. It is, in fact, the calling that Christ places on our lives to always be widening, bit by bit, the love and inclusion that we can offer the world. But it's okay to recognize that widening our circles of love and inclusion will not always be easy. Anyone who has ever struggled to love a family member suffering from addiction can attest to this fact. When we give and give of ourselves to someone who will not get the help they need, we run the risk of giving so much of ourselves that our lives are ruined too. In those circumstances, it's important to have boundaries that we are careful to establish. And so I always encourage everyone to think critically about the boundaries we need in our relationships to protect ourselves and our loved ones. And yet, at the same time, how can we be widening our circles of love and inclusion? In our society, when we push against racism and homophobia, against transphobia and Islamophobia, when we fight to include people that society would love to exclude, like caravans of immigrants crossing the border or prisoners, when we struggle to forgive the people in our lives who have wronged us, in all of those circumstances, there are going to be significant challenges. People are going to push back against us and tell us that we're wrong. We might be taken advantage of by the very people we choose to love. We might lose friends or wealth because of it. Widening our circles of love and inclusion does not automatically create harmonious families or societies. There are going to be moments when we wonder if it's even worth all the hassle and the trouble. And yet Ruth, the Moabite, the one who was not to be allowed to prosper, the one who should have been left out of the genealogy, is right here in the family tree of Jesus to remind us about what our faith is all about. Whenever possible, let us widen our circles of love and inclusion. Amen.